And we're starting with Carol, so $1 billion.
$1 billion, it's really interesting because the World Economic Forum and the UN Conference on Trade have estimated that there is a $2.5 trillion deficit for us to reach the SDGs at this point. So while $1 billion would be phenomenal, and believe me, any of you want to write a check to UNICEF today, happy to take it, but it is not going to fill the gap. So if I had $1 billion, the place that I would invest it in is in education. Clearly, education is the only tool in our arsenal that will, interrupt the cycle of poverty. We know from our research that an educated mom is an educated child. We know that an educated mom is a healthy mom and is a healthy child. We also know that GDP goes up. We know that the impact of what happens every time we do add a year of education to a child. We know that, I don't want to get my numbers correct, but each year of average education raises per capita income from 3% to 6%, and wages for men and women worldwide about 10%. So every year of education has a dramatic impact. We also know that if we are able to prepare young people to take on a challenge of a job, clearly that's going to have an overall impact on everything else that we're trying to provide. So, again, $1 billion, not enough, but if I had it, clearly education.
Great, thank you. Catherine, what's your $1 billion going on?
Yeah, well, very briefly, so at C-Note, our focus is domestic. We create accessible, large financial products to drive more financial inclusion. So my expertise is very much around the United States. And so with $1 billion, I'd say the three areas I'd focus on are racial equity, women's equity, and democratization. So let me say a few words about each. In terms of racial equity, to no surprise in everybody in this room, right? We're not looking at a racial gap in equality, we're looking at a chasm, right? And so the median family wealth for a white family right now is over 40 times that of an African-American family. It's over 22 times that of a Latino family. And so what are we doing about that, right? And so the first third, I would say, I would invest into innovative solutions that are addressing some of these products of racism, things like unequal access to education, unequal access to childcare, the need for more fair representation in our legal system, and the rampant discrimination that happens in our labor force, and specifically the discrimination that happens in financial services. I think the good news is there's some innovative solutions happening, and so some of those investments going to things like Aluminum Capital, like Boston Impact Initiative, some really phenomenal initiatives, and I'm hopeful. I think the second is around women. I know women is a very timely topic right now, but I think oftentimes we think about women as it relates to the income gap, right? Women make 80 cents to the dollar, when in fact the real issue here is the wealth gap. Women today women own 30 cents for every dollar of ownership that men own. And for Black and Latino women, that's even worse. They own less than a penny. And so what are we doing to really bridge that wealth gap? Because I do believe, and the wonderful group at the Closing the Women's Wealth Gap say this eloquently, that is one of the greatest ways that we can improve equality for women is closing that wealth gap. And so the other piece of the wealth and the women's issue is it doesn't just affect things like home ownership for women or entrepreneurship for women. It affects much more. I think most of us have heard about what's happening around domestic violence and harassment. And in fact, the number one reason women stay in abusive relationships is financial insecurity. And so we are beholden to use finance as an instrument for positive change as it relates to investing in women's wealth. And then I think the second piece is around mental health. We don't often think about that as a women's issue or women's wealth issue. But we do know that attachment for children is critical as it relates to women's mental health. And yet, in the United States, there is still no federal paid leave act. And so what are we doing about that to really create more opportunity for women, and specifically for low-income women, to have those first months and years of time with their children without having to race back into the workforce? And so again, I'm hopeful because there's some great solutions. And so the investment, that second piece of investment, would be in around things like the wonderful Women's Livelihood Bond, Calvert's Win-Win Initiative, which addresses international women's as it relates to energy, and my favorite community development financial institutions, CDFIs, who are working on the ground with women as it relates to both technical assistance and fair access to capital. And lastly, I'll say the third piece that I would invest in is democratization. And more specifically, democratization as it relates to impact investing. I think many of us in the room have been asked this question. If not, what would you do with $1 billion? What would you do with $1 million or $100,000? And we advise our clients accordingly. But I think there's a problem with that. And I'd like to shake up the ground on which many of us sit right now. When we concentrate the power to solve all of our issues in the hands of the many, right? I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. So really questioning the fact that we really have concentrated the power of solving these issues via investment in the hands of the few. And so I'm a big believer in democratizing impact investing, meaning how do we create more accessible vehicles that all of us can use to really vote with our dollars, vote with our values. And I think that can go a long way to invest in many of the problems that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you. Johnny?
To go in the sense of what you mentioned, it goes down to the vision of a woman. Her name is Ariane de Rothschild. She asked us in 2006 the question, if I give you $1 billion, what would you do?
So you had the question before the exam.
Yeah.
I think this might be unfair.
Yeah,
Right.
so, please bear in mind that at the end, she didn't give us the billion. Don't be too enthusiastic about it. And the mission was, how can we gather $1 billion? Because there is a huge difference between getting a check or convincing others to join.
Sure.
And today, with the 100 million that we got from the family to invest, and not about doing philanthropy, is really to invest, we ended up collecting 3 billion, of which the good news, 800 million comes from the wealth management division with a 100,000 ticket. So there is a collective conscience created around the matter, and we should all be proud of. However, to answer the question now, where we do invest and how. First, we don't sacrifice return to generate impact. It's about managing impacts. It's about measuring impact. I know the professor mentioned this many times, but we should earn our living. The 2 and 20 that the lady mentioned, yeah, we should earn it because we have large teams, because we are in the ground. And this requires more than 2 and 20. The moment the fees is justified by resources in face, we should not argue about fees. The question should be why we pay 2 and 20 for people who are doing leverage finance and creating value through financial engineering and putting us after in great problems like the financial crisis we went through. Parenthesis closed. Now, to get back to what we do, we put the money at work where we put finance at the service of the industrial sector and not the opposite. What we do, we chase opportunity where the dry powder doesn't go. And that's a very good news for our investors because the dry powder is at its peak. We have more than 1,700 million of dry powder in hand of managers. Today, through managing externalities, managing impacts, we create maybe less return, one would argue less than market return, but we create sustainable return over the long run without getting the effect of the cycles. That's how we do it. Where we do it? We do it in Europe, we do it in Latin America, we do it in Africa. In which sectors? First, we invest in agroforestry. Agroforestry, it's about small projects where you combine both agriculture commodities with forestry plantation. Having the capacity of combining both, you can stock volatility through timber, and you create, on a central project that we support, high value-added product that generates a premium independent from the volatility of the commodity. Why? Because through traceability, social impact, and managing the externalities, investors, consumers, both are paying to get access to traceability. And this is a very good news. By the way, small advertising of what we're doing. If you end up buying a capsule of Nespresso of Nicaragua origin, this comes from our farm where the whole traceability of the value chain is there. What we're doing as well is about financial inclusion, about women empowerment, about helping the entrepreneurs in Africa, where we know that there is second and third generations who studied abroad, who after the financial crisis came back to their home countries, to countries where there is economic diversification. And in these countries, we help local champions to turn them into regional champions by bringing in the governance and let them really enjoy the creation of a middle class, getting the best out of the leapfrog effect. Last but not least, what we do in Europe. What we do in Europe, the industrial sector is suffering for two reasons. First, Europe is not anymore an industrial player. Second, we're imposing much more constraint on industrials in Europe than elsewhere in the world. We should keep these constraints because we care about the future for our kids, the future for our planet. How we can help these industrials and how can we benefit from this? What we do in Europe, we're losing each 10 years for urban sprawl, we're using the surface of a French department of arable lands for urban sprawl, while we have old, abandoned, impaired, heavily polluted industrial sites, because short-minded real estate promoters doesn't want to take the risk. No one takes these. So we transform them by putting the equity, and we support the industrial by giving them means to transform constraint into opportunities.
Great, thank you. Sean?
Thank you. I work for someone who has had the chance to answer the exam question and has answered it sort of 13 times over and counting. And I think at the beginning, I want to sort of say that one of the insights that I've taken away from the work of George Soros in the past is that the title of this session, The Power of Money, should give us pause for thought. Money investment is necessary, but clearly not sufficient. And before we get sold on the power of money and the power we have at our hands, let's not forget that without the role of government, without the role of civil society, without active work on policy, without addressing fundamental injustices, this money that we can throw around is unlikely to have any impact. And I think we should also be clear that we have been a major part of the problem. And so if we're lucky and if we work hard, we may get to be part of the solution. But let's not forget that a large part of the world will hold us accountable for the problems that we have created with the tools that we're now looking to deploy. So it's a sort of down moment to begin with. The exciting thing is that with $1 billion at one's hands, what would you look for? You would look for a large addressable market, a market rich with opportunities. You'd look, secondly, for a large set of social problems that affect significant numbers of the world at a global scale. And thirdly, you'd look for an area in which there's a rich pool of entrepreneurial talent that's tried and tested, talent that will work and take no shortcuts to success. If you take those three lenses, I would invest in the economic empowerment of women, addressing a social injustice perpetrated against 50% of the world's population, unable to fully and fairly participate in the global economy, is too insane for words, and clearly the economic benefits to all of us of investing in that don't need to be sort of rehearsed. I would invest in the education of young women. I think someone said, which I really liked, that an investment in the education of a girl child is the only investment with the potential for theoretically an infinite return on investment. And that thought that by making an investment in one person, we can have that extraordinary change of set of consequences and unlock change in the world is a very powerful argument for investing in the education of girl children. The subject I want to talk about, though, today, and one that we're particularly focused on, has those three properties. A global issue that affects all of us is the scale of refugee and migrant movement across the world. 65 million people currently today, refugees and displaced people. The UN statistics suggest it could be 300, or if the demographics in Africa and climate change play out, as much as 1 billion people on the move in the next 30, 40 years. So that's a global issue. My own home country of England is showing the effects of the sort of political insanity of the response to that perceived threat. And yet, this is obviously a massive set of opportunities as well. If you had screened the opportunities, if you were an investor and you had invested with a refugee lens in the US in every wave of investment in the previous century, you would have outperformed the domestic index in every sector and in every wave of refugee and migrants who came to this country. Consistently, these are entrepreneurs who made it to the entrepreneurial opportunity by talk about qualified deal flow, by having been tested, by having sacrificed, by having with all the qualities that we look for in entrepreneurs are there clearly in refugees and migrants. And if you want to sort of, I've got some statistics, somebody gave me some numbers, so I'm going to read them out because economist and everything. So I'm not an economist. 500,000 immigrants from 155 countries have started small businesses in the UK that produce $1 million a year more of revenue. 13% of the US population, but 21% of entrepreneurs run small businesses in the US that account for $65 billion a year in sales. So is it a large and addressable market? Yes. But it's a difficult market to invest in. It's difficult because they don't come to conferences like this. Thank goodness.
They're not invited.
That they're not invited, I fear. They have better things to be doing. They don't have the contacts. They don't have the cash. They don't have the collateral. They don't have the language. They don't have the opportunities to be able to make contacts, and yet somehow they do. We've found, I'd love to talk about some of the investments we've made, but I'm going to get the cutoff. But the good news is that it's difficult, but it's entirely possible. And I think the future peace and security of the world rests on us recognizing that this movement of people is not a short-term humanitarian crisis. This is a fact of life and a reality of the world going forward. And we need to, allocate capital on that basis.
I want to ask people in the room a question. Would you put your hand up if you were sort of surprised at the things that people picked? Not just not any particular one, but if you felt that there was something they kind of left out, or this wasn't quite what you expected. Just me? I'm surprised no one said something about carbon. If I had $1 billion to spend, I'd be trying to sequester as much carbon as possible or stop the release of as much carbon as possible. And I think it would feed into all of these things. I think we would have less movement of people.
Yeah, may I?
You did mention it among other.
Intentionally, I didn't speak about carbon as a market and a commodity because we failed. Why we failed? Because what requires subsidies is not sustainable.
But if $1 billion to spend, I think I might try to find something about arable land or something about forestry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that's why I'd invest in education to start with, because
Yeah.
I think, and I'm trying to do the quote accurately, and I'll probably bastardize it, but, and it's Thomas Jefferson, and it's something to the effect of, if we solve all the problems of the world, but we don't solve the problems of education, then our children are going to destroy what we bequeath them. But if we solve only the problems of education, then our children can solve the problems of the world. And so I think, at the moment, we're facing a crisis. You talk about 60 million people walking the earth right now. 29 million of those have been forcibly removed from their homes. Tonight, they're sleeping on rocks. They're not sleeping in beds. Their kids are not getting an education. We are losing an entire generation at the moment that will miss out on an education. The Syrian refugee crisis alone is in its 8th year, if I'm accurate. I think it's the 8th year mark is coming up. And these are kids there are many children who have only known life in a refugee camp. They are not getting educated. They are the kids who will be preyed upon, and they will be preyed upon for all of the things that we're trying to.
So you would focus your education money on refugee camps maybe, or?
We're doing, currently, we're doing a partnership right now.
I'm just talking about your $1 billion.
No, but potentially, when we have a partnership right now with Microsoft that is looking at how we create an education system that moves with the child, passport education, that they're getting something, it's an online platform that will credentialize the education that they do get, so that no matter where these kids land, they can prove they've been educated, because that's a primary issue right now. We have reduced under 5 child mortality significantly. In the 1980s, over 35,000 kids were dying every day of causes we know how to prevent, and those are all kids under the age of 5. Today, that number stands at 15,000. We're going to enjoy our day today. 15,000 kids will die because we don't get to them in time, so not because of something we couldn't prevent. The world's population has tripled since the 1980s. So this is a huge success. I mean, it speaks to what was said. If we had invested in this crisis, we would have shown huge profits on this. And there are so many different studies that have been done that show the impact of the dollar preventing versus the
Let me
cost
ask
of
you one more question.
non-prevention.
This $1 billion, I'm a bit obsessed with it, but that's because I was told it's what I was told to do. Where would you,
And I'm
where would you
waiting
put
for it.
it?
Don't worry, it's okay.
Where would you put it in your, where's the gap? Is it in creating this sort of credentialing system, although it sounds like people with money are helping you on that? Is it in delivery? Is it like...
It's a D, all of the above. It isn't
Yeah, but
a singular. It really isn't a singular, because it is not just building schools. It's making sure there's a trained teacher at the school. It's making sure there's a girls' latrine so culturally girls will get to go to that school. It's putting a well at the school so the girl who's forced to fetch water can now get her water while going to school. It is making sure that we can credentialize what she or he are learning. It is making sure that we're teaching the appropriate skills for the appropriate day and age also.
Sean, you wanted to pop in there?
Did you want? No.
I was just going to say, I think one theme that we've heard is just the importance of sustainability, not just in the context of the environment, but investing in a sustainable fashion that regenerates, right? So if we're talking about profit, we're talking about returns.
Resiliency.
You got it.
Right.
So one investment begets the next, beget the next.
Yeah.
I was challenged with this question because one of my ideas was creating a fund, right, where it's both participatory, democratized, as well as invested from institutional, and then a piece of it is invested, and the other piece goes back to reinvest and reinvest.
Absolutely.
And so future generations are reinvesting in the next generation and the next generation. So using the power investing to perpetuate these great solutions.
Sean?
So I wanted to just draw you, because you raised the challenge about climate, and would you invest $1 billion in climate? And I think that I want to just make the analogy. I think there are sort of 4 stages of the response to the climate change issue. The first was sort of from the investment community. The first was sort of denial, that it's not really happening, we don't need to worry about it. There are some parts of the world that are still in that phase. The second is a sort of tokenist response. Let's do a CSR thing, let's do a cute thing with sort of kids and trees, and that's nice. The third was sort of fads, right? There was this sort of wave of fads of green funds and green tech, and it sort of, they flamed out, they weren't meaningful, they weren't thoughtful. And the fourth stage is where people understand this as a long-term mega trend, they're deeply insightful and understanding of it, and they make large-scale, long-term capital allocation decisions on the basis of an understanding of the issue. And I think that clearly this is not an issue that needs $1 billion, it's an issue that needs $1 trillion, but it's one that's moved through those stages, and I think many, if not most, large corporates are closer down that path towards a sort of thoughtful capital allocation decision. The recognition of the issue of people on the move is way down in the beginning of that curve. And I think if you think about it like a sort of life cycle of an investment, $1 billion is early stage money for a global issue. And that's why I think, for us, we're looking at issues that are still on the cusp of understanding and recognition, and where $1 billion could crowd in significant other money and increase and accelerate the transition through those stages of sort of denial.
Thank you,
But
John.
if I may, it has to be replicable, it has to be resilient. It should not rely on subsidies. It's easy to say this, how to achieve it. There is a gap to address. There is a lot of money out there. The money printing machine, thanks God, after 2008 didn't stop. So the money is there, out there. How to use it smartly, it's a matter of allocation. The gap is not the lack of number of entrepreneurs. He said it. Whether they are immigrants or in their local markets, there is entrepreneurs. What is missing is the bankability of projects. How can we put very early stage money to help entrepreneurs make their project bankable, to address the private sector? And here there is a call on action for the DFIs, the development financial institutions. We should help them and encourage them to do more on helping entrepreneurs make their project bankable for the private sector to jump in. Because at the end of the day, private sector is a cold feet.
But that's part of the reason I think who you partner with becomes critical. One of the reasons we as an organization have jumped into the impact investing space is we are 14,000 boots on the ground. We are there yesterday, today, tomorrow. You talk about measurement, we do measurement. That's what we're known for. And we can help that process. I mean, I can think of 2 or 3 ways where we've done that already.
Public-private partnerships.
And when you think sustainability even, I think we think of it in terms of what are we doing and how do we build sustainability into what we're doing. So for example, we're partnering right now with a company, and I'm going to get the name wrong probably, Conceptos Plásticos. They have figured out a way to take plastic bags and make them into what are essentially bricks. They're like Legos almost. They modularly sit on each other. They are 50% lighter than regular bricks. They sustain for, I think it's 20% longer than a regular brick, and the cost of them is less. The company, the reason we got really excited about it is not only because of the usability of the end product, but A, they're actually cleaning the earth to make their product, and the carbon emissions that are saved because of the lack of construction was phenomenal on the return on this. And they're paying the fair market price to the person, the individual, who is actually collecting the bags in the developing nation. So creating jobs, saving carbon emissions, providing an opportunity, building a better product. It's a great project. It's the one we're invested in.
Can
I want
to jump on something?
I'd like to open up to some questions. Who would like to ask one of our 4 putative billion-dollar investors a pointed question as to how exactly they do this? I have one here. Yeah, it's coming to you.
Coming to you right behind you.
Okay, thanks. Elsie Mayo, I'm representing the Green Money Journal today. So Johnny, you said the bankability of these early stage projects is what's missing. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of what have you seen that works? Who's doing something about it? Is it a question of reorienting our education of in business to help generate the capacity to nurture those things instead of the capacity to concentrate wealth?
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
this is a very lengthy question. I'll try to do it in 30 seconds to give a right answer to. It's very important to help the entrepreneur understand how his project can become resilient, replicable, and global. We live in a global village. If his project is not global, forget about it, first. Second, should not rely on subsidies, and the customer acquisition cost nowadays, whatever the product and the business model is key in the development of a global application. And through creation of resilient solutions, we can keep people in their home countries. We can avoid the immigrants flows that we're going through. We can do, rather than doing preservation of natural forest, let's help the farmers get solid revenues from multiple chains, not for them to do deforestation to live. So to achieve this, we should have a strong link in public-private partnerships between the public sector, who should bring in the money at risk to make sure that the project and help the entrepreneur to achieve a bankable project, for the private sector to jump with equity, and banks provide long-term debt as they should. And here the regulator has to understand that we cannot constrain banks by investing in the long run. The banks should sustain the debt market in a way to make those projects bankable.
Does anyone else want to jump in on this question of bankability?
So I say one thing. First, I want to just jump on the sort of subsidy question.
Right.
Let's not forget, Tesla exists because of $350 million worth of government subsidy. All of the businesses in Silicon Valley exist because of huge public investment in public infrastructure, in education systems, and in frankly, in sort of technology investments that then the private sector jumps in on, thank you very much, and makes huge fortunes on. So I think your point is absolutely right about the role of the DFIs, and I think you referred the same thing to the sort of partnerships that can make these things sort of viable. We've been trying to deploy money in the frontline states. We've been investing in a series of funds in Jordan, in Lebanon, and shortly in Greece that fund SMEs. There is more capital than there is deal flow available. There's more capital than there are projects available. And the DFIs raise more money. The DFIs sort of put money together in different shapes and put it together again in other shapes, thinking that it'll sort of unlock that, and it doesn't. At the UN General Assembly, Jim Kim announced a partnership with Open Society Foundations to create what is in effect a merchant bank for the region that would focus on developing early-stage self-liquidating capital and funding and technical assistance to support the development of that pipeline and that transition from small to medium-sized enterprises into the bankability and into the... So I think one of the things we need to do is we need to invest in infrastructure, soft infrastructure, intermediaries and other things that will facilitate those and make that market begin.
That's what we're doing. Next to each fund we have a technical assistance facility with donors' money to reduce the risk for the managers of the private sector.
I have another question over here, and then I've one at the back. I'll take both of them, if that's okay. So this gentleman here and the lady standing near the window.
Thank you. Sorry. Martin Whitaker from Just Capital. Excellent panel. I have a simple question. What is an acceptable return on capital for your $1 billion?
Very good question. There's a lady at the back. I'll take the question as well, and then we can just pick and choose who wants to answer which bit. Can you put your hand up again, person with question? Thank you. So you can all choose, you all have to pick a number out of your heads now. Yeah, do we have the question?
Oh, sure, sir. Sean Hinton, this question's for you, just a bit of a follow-up on the refugee crisis. Understandably that this is a phenomenon that's here to stay, and I just want to know from really the whole panel, what are the different initiatives that you see happening and being taken on federal level to enable a space where more opportunities are extended to migrants in general, globally, in different economies?
Carol, I'm going to start with you on the return, because you're the person who's claimed boldly an infinite return.
See, you're right. For me, the return, though, for us is the measure of children's lives. Kids will live. That is the return on the investment for us. It's not a financial number. You know, I think that financial number is more determined by all of you in the market than it is by UNICEF. Our measure of success is the impact on kids' lives.
But presumably you had, I mean, it's horrible when you have to do this, when you have to say, you know, it's £1 million for a life, or it's 50,000 for a life or something. You must have a...
Actually...
Because you must decide between projects. How do you decide between projects?
We decide between projects, again, on the number of lives we can save.
But then that's bang for buck. It's lives for buck, you know?
I guess it is, but
I mean, it is.
I don't have a number that I'm going to quote you.
Okay,
I don't.
Right. But you must have it internally, because you must look and say, I can save twice as many lives this way than that way. So effectively you do.
I mean, I think our foray, again, into the market is more about the global scope of the project. You know, the other big projects, for example, the first time we did this, it was around vaccines. And it was, I believe it was Nigeria. Ed, keep me honest here, I think it was Nigeria. The Nigerian government had committed $10 million a year for 3 years for vaccines. The UN is not allowed to carry debt. It's a cash-only business. So UNICEF USA created a bridge fund, and the bridge fund said, all right, we'll front the 30 million instead of 10 million a year. That means $30 million worth of vaccines will go out this year. We will save far more lives if we vaccinate more people this year. So that in and of itself is a return.
Fine.
But secondarily to that, by buying them all in 1 year, we drove the price point down in the marketplace. So it wasn't only a savings to UNICEF, it was a savings to everybody. And for UNICEF alone, we saved $18 million on the number of vaccines we bought. So more kids' lives saved at a lower price for everybody. So those are the metrics for us.
Catherine, you have a similar difficulty, I would say, trying to put figures
I'll tackle it. I'll go there. Yeah.
You'll go there. Good woman.
Go there.
Look, I think it's an excellent question. And I think one of the things we think about at C-Note is we think about technology, community-driven impact, and metrics, right? Because we do believe if we're serious about creating sustainable solutions at scale and sustainable investments at scale, we can't forget the power of technology. We can't forget the incredible power of community-driven impact, so the voice of the community in our decisions and in our investment cycle. And then third, measurement, as we've heard again and again this morning. And so with those things in mind, you know, I shared with you kind of 3 areas that I would invest in. Several of the examples I gave you are all instruments around debt. So I would say very candidly, I'd probably invest a third of that $1 billion into concessionary returns, grants, really to get things moving off the ground and provide risk and innovation where oftentimes investments will not step in. And then 2/3 into these debt instruments, which quite frankly, most of them are commanding close to a market rate return. So anything from, you know, a 2 to 5% and onwards. So that would be the expectation. And I think most of the examples I gave are stepping up for that. So I think it's an exciting time.
Great, thank you. John?
So we have the luxury not to think about any benchmark. We believe in absolute return. And the return is a matter of a risk-reward. And the risk, it's not only financial risk. You have to manage all your externalities. Then you derive your return. In our case, on the soil remediation fund in Europe, we generate 12% return, and we take from point zero, where we have the pollution, the social aspects, the unuse of the property, and all the transformation, and we developed a tool to measure those impacts from point zero to point one and determine on that road how much we achieved as impact on each of the metrics. We developed it with the Polytechnique of Lausanne. And so it's not about generating double-digit return using leverage. You can do it nowadays. That is cheap. There is a lot of money. But it's about how you manage your risk to create resilient and replicable opportunities. And that's what we do. We achieve return that I know that even if there is a cycle or a crisis, I will deliver this return because I manage my externalities.
So, Sean, you're going to give us a figure, but you're also going to talk about the refugee question.
I'm going to dodge that question because I think it was better answered than I can answer. And we're in the luxurious and I think not to be taken lightly position of, in a sense, not having to answer that question because we.
But with this, so what you're saying then is that with this $1 billion, you're accepting no return.
No, absolutely not. What I'm saying is that's not the question to ask. It's not the question we have to ask.
Okay.
What we have to ask the question is what is the kind of impact and return? I don't want to return to the first debate and redefine profitability in some other sort of way, but we are in the not to be taken lightly and not replicable situation of not having to address shareholders or speak to shareholders about anything other than impact.
Because you're addressing stakeholders.
Yeah, so I recognize that's not a satisfactory answer for people who have to raise money from the public markets, who have to raise money from pension holders, and that is a question, and you will answer the question, and you'll know because your investors will have different answers, as everybody said this morning. But we have to answer the question of what impact we want to have. I think that as a industry, the impact investment industry has to really address the level of risk that we don't take. Because I think that given the scale of the problems that we are tackling, we seem to leave the risk for people who are investing in new forms of social media. So I don't see that level of risk-taking in the impact space, which is where it should be and where it should be commensurate to the outcomes that we're trying to have. I wanted to take the question, if I might.
You please do, but you've got 1 minute.
In 1 minute, 4 seconds on federal. The question was, what are we doing at the federal level, I presume in the US or other ways? And I want to sort of say, I don't think the game is at the federal level. I think, there's a fight to be had and governments are sort of dealing with what they're dealing with, but it's crazy time in the world at the moment for governments. And actually, our focus is on cities and is on transnational solutions and is on technologies that cross those boundaries. Cities do extraordinary things. New York City ID is available for every single person resident in this city. It doesn't matter if they're a refugee or migrant, illegal, not illegal. In fact, they keep those records on pieces of paper so that they can tear them up if the federal government comes. I think that's what somebody told me, because they want to operate outside the federal system. So I don't think and I think if you look at the way in which governments have responded to the global compacts on migration and refugees, it's a fail. What we're working on is with cities that have huge municipalities that have huge power. We're looking at creating at technologies that can cross those boundaries, that can create transnational solutions. A nation of refugees not bounded by place or specific sort of regulatory environments. We're investing in funds that are looking at technologies that enable these kinds of responses to be made available to people regardless of where they are.